Okay, I'm going to build a sample application demonstrating some of the ideas that we've learned in the first few parts of the C# programming series. Hopefully this will help to bring together the information we've learned, the technical details of the C# language, plus demonstrate a little bit of programming style and process. So we're going to build a console application. So here I have Microsoft Visual Studio open. So I'm going to create a new project, and the project window the new project window will demonstrate or show, display all of the different types of projects you can build in Visual Studio. And depending on what you have installed, it can be quite extensive. In our particular case, we're going to use a Windows program, and it's going to be a console application. So I am going to start that, and you'll see that we end up with some boilerplate code, some code that is pre-existing for a console application. And we're going to work strictly with inside of main here. We're not going to be building any additional functions or classes. That'll be for a later demonstration. And so I think the one we'll do here is a program that will fill an array with some random integers and then find the largest integer in that array and display that back to the user. I think this will be a nice little sample application that will demonstrate if statements and looping and creation of variables. And we will use one little piece that's sort of outside the scope of our lesson so far, and that'll be this random function that this random class that will generate the random numbers for us. But you can kind of just take that as a magic black box that gives us random numbers. So let's start off with describing what we want to do. So I want an application that stores random integers in an array and finds the largest integer in that array. So this is my overall goal. So how am I going to accomplish that? Well, before I begin writing any code, what I usually do is I usually work out what it is that I plan to do to solve that particular problem. So I am going to ask the user for the number of items to store in the array. And then after I do that, I am going to ask the user for the largest size of integer store in the array. Those are two different things. So this first one is how many do I want to store, and the second one is how big should any one random number be. So I might store 50 items with random numbers between 0 and 10, for example. And then I want to fill the array with random integers. Okay, so now I've asked the user how big to make it. I've now created this random array of integers, and so now I need to find the largest integer. And then I need to print out so that would pretty much be the extent of my program. If I work out how to do each of these sub pieces, I will have accomplished my overall goal. So I like to work this way, where I put in some comments and build what I call pseudocode. And this is the highest altitude version of pseudocode here. This is just a description of what I'm attempting to accomplish. I might then break this down into smaller pieces in more code-like terms if that was a complicated thing. So let's start off here and see if we can build some of these things. So I'm going to ask the user for the number of items to store in the array. So in order to ask an input from a user, I'm going to use a console read line, and in order to remember that value, I need a variable. So what type of variable is going to store the number of items in the list? Well, the number of items in the list is going to be an integer, so I will use an integer variable. So I start with the keyword int. Now I give it a name. So what am I going to call this? Number of items in the list. So maybe, how about item num? And I'm going to say that this is going to store the number of items in the list, in the array. Keep using the word list. List in computer science is a meaningful thing, but I'm using it colloquially here. Okay, so if I just put a prompt on the screen waiting for somebody to type the number, the user won't know what's going on. So I have to prompt them first. And a good format to use to prompt people is to use a console.write. I've used a lot of console.write line, and console.write sends the information to the screen but leaves the cursor sitting next to the object. So here I'm going to tell it, so how about enter number of items. And now the cursor will be sitting right next to that, waiting for the person to type something. So to get input back from the user, I use a console.readline, and console.readline is going to come back with an answer. So I have to store it somewhere. So I'm going to say I want the item number to be set equal to the response from console.readline. You'll notice I get this red undersquiggle here, and it says that it cannot implicitly convert from type string to integer. So I have to tell it very clearly that I want to interpret the answer that the person types back as an integer. So I'm going to use a convert function, convert.toInt32, and what this format is saying is take the answer from the console, whatever the person types, and send it off to this thing that's a function. And we'll go into more details later as a function. But basically, it takes whatever it's given and spits back an integer. Now, you'll notice that this is a place for a runtime error, because it's possible that the person didn't type a number that can be converted into an integer. They could have typed, when somebody says enter the number of items, they could have said a lot. And a lot can't be converted into an integer. For this particular assignment, we're going to assume that the user follows directions. That's not what you would normally do in a full-fledged application. You would build in code here to guarantee that the user types in an integer. And you'd do some error checking and some interception of exceptions and things like that. We'll cover that later. So for now, we're just going to assume the user is going to be cooperative. Okay, so now I have the number of items in the list. And so now I can go on to my next part. It says ask the user for the largest size integer to store. Well, it's basically the same thing I just did. So normally what I would do is I would copy this code, and I would paste it back here so that I can avoid a lot of typing. So now I got to change a variable name here. So instead of the number of items in the array, I want the largest size. So how about max int as my variable name? And this is going to store the largest random number size. Change my prompt. Instead of enter the number of items, I will say enter the maximum random size. And I need to store this in max int instead of in num size. So I now have two variables, one that will tell me the number of items in my list, and one that will tell me the largest type or the largest size to generate. Okay, so now it's on to fill the array with random numbers. So before I can fill an array, I have to create the array. So it's going to be an array of integers. So remember, the format is the type int followed by square brackets that tells us it's going to be an array. I have to give it a name. So I'm going to call it numbers. And this is going to be equal new. the new keywords necessary when we create arrays so that it'll store the allocation in the heap. So new and int. And this is where I now tell it how big I want the array to be. Well, how big do I want the array to be? I want it to be equal to the size of the number that the user typed in. So item num. And so I now have an array that can store however many numbers that the person wants it to store. Now I need to put a random number in that every single item in that list. So this sounds to me like a for loop. Whenever I hear something or in my mind I think about doing something that's going to happen for every single item, I do a loop, and since I know how many items are in this loop, I use a for loop. So for int I. Okay, so I start the loop. Oops. I start the loop at 0 because it's a 0 indexed array. Arrays are 0 indexed. So I start at 0 and I keep going as long as the value of I is less than this max item number. So if I have 30 items, I'm going to go from 0 to 29. And each time through the loop, I increment I by 1 because I want to put a random number in every single item in the list in my array. So um, So I need to generate and store a random number. Now here's where I said I'm going to use a trick or a piece of information that we haven't really talked about before. So I am going to actually use an object called random to create a random number generator. And I'm going to use it down here. So where do I want to store my random number? I want to store it in the array numbers. And which slot in there do I want to store it in? I want to store it in the one I'm currently working on. Remember, I is counting for me, so I want to store it in slot I. First time through the loop, that'll be slot 0. Second time through the loop, it'll be slot 1, etc. And I want to assign to that value, so I use the equals. That's the assignment operator, remember? I want to assign it this random number. And the way the format works is it's r.next, and it's going to ask inside this parenthesis, what's the biggest number I want to possibly generate? It's going to be called max int in our case. So this will generate, return an integer between 0 and max int size. Do that over and over again, and my array will be filled up with the integers that I want. Okay, I'm working my way through here and basically ticking off things on my to-do list of my comments. Now I need to find the largest integer in the array. So I need to develop some scheme. So my algorithm or my plan is going to have to be worked out. So here's where I'm now going to extend my pseudocode a little bit, and instead of talk about, okay, just go find the largest integer, now I might describe to myself how I'm going to do that. So I am going to work my way through the entire list and check to see if each item in the list is bigger than the one I currently believe is biggest. So let's write that down. Go through the list one item at a time and see if the current item is larger. Let me put a return in here. Is larger than the one I currently believe is biggest. Okay, that's my routine. So how might I do that? Maybe I can explain this algorithm a little bit better with a quick little drawing. So let me see if I can open up OneNote here real quick. Okay, let's assume that I have a list of numbers. Let's say 10, 8, 6, 15, 13, 2. So that's my list of numbers. And then over here, think of the biggest. I'm going to keep a notepad, which I'm going to call biggest. And I'm going to work my way down this list and decide if I can find the biggest number in this list. So remember, when we teach a computer to do something, we have to do something by following a bunch of rules, as opposed to just looking at this and saying, well, it's clearly 15. Well, that's not what computers do. We need to follow some sort of scheme. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, let's assume that the very first item in the list is the biggest. So I'll just write down 10 on my notepad. Then I want to look at each item in this list. So I'm going to look at 10 and say, is 10 bigger than 10? No, or no, because I already copied it there. So, okay, then move on. So is 8 bigger than 10? No. Okay, move on. Is 6 bigger than 10? No. Move on. Is 15 bigger than 10? Yes. Okay, so now I should replace my 10 with 15. I now can go on and say, is 13 bigger than 15? No. Move on. Is 2 bigger than 15? No. I've now gone all the way through my list. So I can confidently say that whatever is stored on my notepad here, called biggest, will be the largest integer in that array. So go through the list one item at a time and see if the current item is larger than the one I currently believe is biggest. If so, replace biggest. There's my algorithm. So now I need to build that. Okay, so if I think about that, go through the list one item at a time. That sounds like a loop, probably some sort of for loop. If the current item is larger than the one that I currently believe is biggest, see if the current item is larger. That sounds like an if condition. It's going to check. If it is, replace biggest with current item. So I need to keep track of biggest because I'm going to be comparing things to it and I'm going to be replacing it. So that sounds to me like a variable. So I have a variable to keep track of biggest out of this algorithm. I have a loop to work my way through the items in the list, and I have an if statement to do my comparison. And none of this is C#. This is just me deciding how I would do this on paper, and then and now interpreting that as C#. So I need an integer that's going to store my largest number. So I'll just call that biggest. And I need a loop. So it's going to be some sort of loop. And the question is in my algorithm, what should my biggest value be before I start the loop? And you could do something like assume that the biggest value is 0 and then start into your loop and compare it to the very first item. Or you could just start by saying, well, let's just assume the first item is the biggest and then start our loop looking at, and then let our loop find the biggest one by comparing it to the very first one. So let's do it that way. Biggest, I'm going to just say, is equal to the first item in my list. So assume the first item is biggest. Now I need to loop through here. So since I'm going to go all the way through the items and the array is iterable, maybe I could use a for each loop here. Let's try that. For each. Okay, so what's in that loop? This loop consists of integers. So for each integer current value in my list numbers, I'm going to do something. And what am I going to do? Well, go through the list one item at a time. That's being handled by this for each loop. And check to see if the current item is larger than the biggest. So how do I do that? Well, it's going to be an if statement. If current value is greater than biggest, I need to do something. What am I going to do? Well, if it's bigger, on my notepad example, I crossed out the old value and copied in the new value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cross out biggest. So I'm going to set biggest equal to current value. So if current value is bigger than biggest, then make biggest equal to current value. So if biggest was 10 and the current value is 15, 15 is greater than 10, so that means my biggest value should now become 15. And if this is not true, what should I do? I should leave biggest alone and move on to the next item. So I can just let that loop back. And at the end of this loop, I now know that I have the largest value stored in this variable called biggest. So there's my little algorithm for finding the largest number. So now let's go ahead and do some printing out. So let's do a console.writeLine. If I just do an empty console writeLine, this just gives me a blank line. So let's get a little bit of space between my input and my output. And now I need to write out what I found. So console.writeLine and do a formatted string, interpolated string, I should say. And we'll say the largest number found in the array is, and now we put in curly braces and we put in the thing we want to print out. Well, biggest should currently hold the largest number in my array. And since I can't see my array, I might like to actually get a view of it. And so let's throw in another blank line, and then let's go through and print out all of the items in the array as well. So we can do that as a for each loop, for each int item in numbers. Console.write formatted string. I'm going to write out the number that's currently item. And let's give a little bit of space between them. And then we need our console.readLine as the last line. In our program, this just pauses the console. Okay, it's possible that we made some mistakes, so we may get an error in here when we run this, but let's see what happens. We are going to ask for input to find out how many items to put in the array. We're going to ask for how large the largest item should be. We're going to use both of those pieces of information to generate an array of random numbers that are all smaller than or equal to or smaller than the max number here. We are then going to loop through the array and look for the biggest number. Biggest is now going to hold that biggest number, so we're going to output that to the user and show them that we are correct. Give that a shot here. Let me change my console. I prefer kind of the old school green screen here. Make it a little easier for people to see. Number of items. Okay, let's put in 15 items. And the maximum item we'll say is 20. So it found the largest number is 17. And if we go down this list, we can see all the random numbers that were generated. And we agree that 17 is in fact the largest. Run that one more time. Let's put in 50 items and the max size 99. And there's my 50 items, and the largest number is 97. So somewhere in there is a 97. Okay, so that is an example of some choices we made for variable storage, like using integers and integer arrays. This also demonstrated some console formatting where you can use write as prompts and readline to read things in. It also demonstrated some looping in a for loop example and in a for each loop. It also demonstrated how we can take some pseudocode type items, pseudocode algorithm, and work through the wording to generate exact C# syntax that's going to meet that algorithm. And then we demonstrated a little bit more console formatting to produce a nicely formatted output. Hope this helps to solidify some of the concepts from some of our novice programming videos and introduce you to a scheme by which you can make your mind work with solving programming problems.